AOC says cancel rent and the dumbest bill in America. This is Mark Fisher with Mark and the Millennials, and the Millennial joining me today during this pandemic is Garrick Ross. And of course, our assistant producer, Christopher Hopkins, and our producer, Adam Coutura. So today's podcast is called AOC says cancel rent. And of course, the dumbest bill in America. So what does she mean by that? She means that she just wants to, first of all, if you are affected by the pandemic, and the chances are that would be everybody out there in podcast land, by the way, me included, and I have no doubt the millennials here included, then you would probably say, okay, well, it's difficult to make your rent payments. It's difficult to make your mortgage payments. It's difficult potentially even to pay your utilities and other necessities, right? So that's understandable. But what AOC is doing is she's using this term cancel rent, which is a national movement now throughout the United States. And the implication is that we don't just cancel it during the pandemic, we cancel rent. We cancel any kind of indebtedness that you have or any responsibility that you have to pay rent, which is very different from getting some sort of forbearance during a pandemic.
It's like the cancel student loan movement. It's just taking those principles and then applying them to a new field.
It is, and except that with a student loan, people voluntarily entered into agreements to borrow money. And with the pandemic, in all fairness, people did not volunteer to be part of a pandemic. They just are. But I do have to say this, the idea of saying to people, you can just cancel rent, I think really most people, when they hear this that are out there, by most people, I mean most people who are in the situation where they are renting, they might say, oh, you know what, she's referring to the fact that I never have to pay rent ever again. Rather than saying, help us with our rent and our bills during this pandemic, they're just saying cancel rent because it's part of that whole, I hate to say it, part of the whole AOC socialism, communism approach, which we're going to listen to shortly. Thoughts on this, Garrick?
Well, I think I want to talk a little bit about the situation that has bred a lot of this distaste for landowners and things like that. And as if you look at a lot of these metropolitan areas and a lot of specific suburbs and a lot of these blue states where people like AOC lives, it is expensive to rent.
Very much so, yes.
Like home ownership aside, it is expensive to rent. Property values are incredible, taxes are high, and it's an uncomfortable living situation. A lot of people, 30, 40, 50% of their paycheck goes just to rent before anything else every month. And so I think there is, both sides of the aisle here should acknowledge that there is an issue when it comes to the affordability of renting. But the solution, I think, is where, our side of the aisle and AOC severely divide. She wants to basically cancel rent going forward, as well as kind of, in some ways, get rid of the concept of private property in its own right.
Therein lies the underlying principle and what they're trying to accomplish. Go ahead. They're trying to get rid of private property.
Trying to get rid of private property and, make, these affordable housing programs almost universal and keep prices as low as possible through rent control, whereas, somebody like me would advocate that the issue is just the general regulation that is accompanying these cities and places like that. If you look at a place like Missouri, Lawrence, Kansas, Texas even is always a good example. In certain places in Florida, they have they're not in your face about regulation. You own a property, you develop it, and then you lease it out, and it's very,
It's been easier to start a business.
It's been easier to start a business. It's easier to pay the taxes on it. The taxes aren't ridiculously high, but if you look at a place like New York, California, which have these very convoluted tax codes as well as municipal tax codes.
See, you brought up a great point, Garrick, because why don't we cancel taxes? Right?
I would be all for it.
Isn't it interesting? The folks like AOC who are all about government, why don't they say cancel taxes?
And I can't think of anything more unfair than taxes.
Let's do that for the next 180 days, and maybe we'll have, a lot more money in our pockets when we actually do go back to work. At least the folks who are working now will, and those when they eventually do go back to work will be able to keep more of the money that they earn.
Yeah.
I have a great example of you about taxes, right? Notwithstanding payroll taxes, which, by the way, the Republicans in Congress are suggesting to have a payroll tax holiday for a period of time, which would be huge. Yeah. But I know someone who was looking to purchase a restaurant, right? They're looking to purchase the business as well as the building, the restaurant building. And they backed out of the deal for one reason and one reason only. And you know what it was?
Taxes?
The property taxes on this restaurant, if you were to purchase the building, were $1,000 a week.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Let me rephrase that. Let me restate that. $52,000 a year just in property taxes. That would be $1,000 a week in property taxes. And what I think is fascinating is that translates all over to also the folks who live in that same town that I'm referring to, and I'm not going to call them out, but that same town, if you live in that town, your property taxes, if you're an owner, are through the roof.
Especially if you own a property with subleases and things like that.
And if you decide to lease, let's say, your upstairs or your basement to someone, an apartment, right?
Yep.
You're doing it because you're trying to, in large part, just to be able to afford to pay the property taxes.
Yeah.
And so what AOC and the socialists do not ever talk about is the unsustainability of property taxes and the general tax burden of payroll taxes, sales taxes, the cumulative tax burden on all these working people. Why don't we why don't we cancel some of those?
Because, and I think everybody always forgets, the businesses themselves do, and this is a fundamental, it's like the first thing you learn when you step into an Econ 101 class, which I think some people in Congress should go back and take again, is that taxes are never paid by the business. They are never paid by the property owner. They are always transferred on to the clientele.
The property owner, if the property owner is occupying the property owner is paying the taxes.
Yeah, but say we're talking in the instance of renters, he's going to take the burden of those taxes and shift it onto their rent because it's the only way he can make up the difference.
The property owner has to cover those costs to be able to pay for the property, otherwise they're going to lose the property.
Exactly.
But you look at the $52,000 a year property tax bill. By the way, we're not talking about a massive property. We're talking about a relatively small building that houses a restaurant that's $52,000 a year. And you say to yourself, gee, why is it that restaurant after restaurant that occupies this building, whether they are leasing the building or purchasing the building, why do they always fail?
Yeah.
Because government is like your partner.
Yeah.
It's not even yours. You're renting it from the government. Even though they say you own it, it's basically a big mirage.
Yeah. I mean, I saw an example on Twitter the other day. There's a person who owns a barbecue shop in Nashville, Tennessee. And you'd think Tennessee off the bat would generally be a low tax state. And for the most part, it is from state taxes and things. But when you talk about municipal taxes, which is where a lot of these issues go unresolved, is that people don't realize that a lot of the tax burden that we talk about that is inhibiting businesses and people and renters, it's not necessarily your state tax burden, it is your local, it's your municipal tax burden. It's why it's expensive to live in cities like Nashville.
It's the cumulative tax burden. It's everything combined.
Everything combined, and that little local on top of it. You know, when you go to places like DC or Nashville, where these cities are trying to raise their own revenue aside, that you start coming into these problems. And this restaurant owner, this barbecue owner in Nashville, Tennessee, you know, he's paying $10,000 a week in taxes to keep his doors open because he has an even bigger property. But he has a lot of, you know, customers, people who come in and support him.
And by the way, regulatory burdens are also indirect taxes.
Yes.
So to the extent that you own an apartment building and there are lots of regulatory burdens that are constantly being put on you,
safety inspections,
then you probably are going to have to raise your rent to cover those costs.
Environmental considerations, things like that, yeah.
But AOC, she says, you know, let's cancel rent and cancel my rent while you're at it. We have a few clips from AOC talking about this and basically talk about the pandemic and the cancel rent movement. And at the end, you're going to get a feel for what she's really up to, which is to socialize property ownership. She has no intent of making cancel rent a temporary movement. She wants it to be a long-term movement and turn the United States into, I don't know, North Korea, where the state owns everything. Or maybe Venezuela, which is, I guess, one of her...
Soviet Union, where everybody lived in the same type of house with the same type of furniture, and nobody really had anything nicer or worse than anybody else.
And we have the first of these clips, and here is the first clip of AOC.
But I also think it's important for us to talk about the fact that housing has been a public health issue since before this pandemic as well. When we talk to our nurses, when we talk to our wonderful, amazing nurses here in the Bronx and in Queens, many of them organizing with the Nurses Union, our nurses have also been fighting for housing policy as well. And why is that? Because housing is one of the number one social indicators of your health. If you go through displacement, if you are evicted, if you are foreclosed on, and you don't know where to go, it can have an enormous health toll on yourself.
So she's confusing something. She's talking about first responders during the pandemic. And first of all, thank you very much, first responders. You guys are all heroes. The men and women who are the first responders in hospitals, the nurses, the doctors, the EMTs, the firemen, the police, heroes, right? We really appreciate what you do. But the fact of the matter is those are the folks who are getting paid, all right? So they are probably able to pay their bills because they are still working, thankfully, and they are also being paid. So I'm not really sure why she brought those folks up.
Oh, because it's not just about the coronavirus, Mark. It's about more than that, So while those people may be getting paid during, this pandemic, I think she just is using this as an indicative segue of overall rent policy.
Of overall rent policy and ownership policy.
Yep.
Essentially, what she wants to do, right, is to abolish ownership.
Yeah.
Which she doesn't actually say, but she intimates it a number of times in these other clips.
Yeah, it's still unpopular to say that, abolishing private property. I think most Americans would kind of turn over and be like, what is going on there? So they try to get to it in more subtle ways.
You know what I find interesting? This is the same congresswoman in New York City who said that she didn't want Amazon in her district because they exploited workers. So who is working right now during this pandemic?
Amazon.
All of the workers at Amazon.
Yeah.
And why are they still working? Because they're considered essential, because we have an on-demand economy. When people go online, they're ordering stuff to be delivered because they want a touchless kind of service, so they have a very low probability of getting sick from this, virus. And so Amazon, of course, is doing well. But she didn't want them in their district. So she would have had all these jobs, and instead of all this misery, of course, my understanding is Amazon was going to hire something like 10,000 people. I mean, just a massive number of folks.
Yeah, that's an interesting debate because, I had some issues with the way that people go about trying to covet places like Amazon to come to their district. I think a lot of the tax breaks that a lot of these cities are willing to heft out kind of outweigh the potential benefits of bringing a place like Amazon, but she
single-handedly chased them away by using the socialist argument.
Yeah, by using the worker issue. And I think rather than discussing the tax breaks, they should have discussed the tax breaks they were giving.
Her argument is it's better to not have a job than it is to work
for an exploitative worker.
For Amazon, which is the dumbest.
I wonder if she got that right from Marx or Lenin.
Exactly. But we have a second clip of AOC where she says rent cancellation is the answer because those bad landlords are hiking your rent. By the way, they're not doing it during a pandemic because it's prohibited, but that's what she says anyway. She
also
lies.
Rent control in most of these cities. You can't raise it past a
certainly
certain
not in New York City.
Year.
That's the case for sure.
Yeah.
And so here is the clip with AOC.
One of the first things that we talk about, which is our first demand, is rent cancellation. And oftentimes the first reaction is, what about the landlords? What about people with mortgages? What about, mom and pops? And I think it's important to recognize the fact that there are some folks that have, that are mom and pop landlords that own maybe one home and that they rent out to tenants. But the thing is that there's a huge difference between that and a commercial landlord that owns a huge luxury condominium with tons of people, or even just any that owns a huge building with tons of units that's hiking up rent on all of their tenants.
So there you go. So these big corporations that own all of these apartment buildings are hiking your rent. First of all, they're not doing that during the pandemic. And secondly, as you said, Garrick, places like New York City, where she represents a small part of New York City, a dense area, by the way, which my understanding is also ground zero for the pandemic, and certainly in her district as well. So I certainly think that that's an awful thing. But she's, at the same time, is she talking about the pandemic? Is she talking about solutions to fixing the pandemic, solutions to getting people back to work? Is she talking about vaccines? Is she talking about science? Is she talking about any of these things that are relevant today? No, she's talking about canceling rent, and she's basically planting the seeds of envy with all of her constituents, basically saying that the reason there's a pandemic is because of those bad landlords.
Yeah, there's two things I want to contend with in that saying. The first thing was that she said that she goes, there are a few, mom and pop landlords, but the reality is most landlords are mom and pop. I think I've seen, I did some research on this topic before we did this, and I think the numbers that I saw was generally accepted that anywhere between 70 to 75% of rental units in the United States are owned by mom and pop, people versus the other 20 to 25%, which are owned by a conglomerate. But then she goes on to make the point that these conglomerates and these, big companies that do development and rental properties, that there's a distinction there, that somehow because they're a company doing this, that they're a worse entity, or that they're, evil per se, for lack of a better term. And I don't agree with that, and I don't think that there should be any differential between whether or not somebody's getting screwed that's a mom and pop and whether somebody's getting screwed because they're a company. I think at the end of the day, these companies do just as much for helping renters.
I have no doubt. Look, I have no doubt, Garrick, that there are some landlords who aren't the best landlords, and we've all rented from those landlords.
And it can be mom and pops who are bad landlords, and it can be companies that are bad
I was a
landlords.
tenant at one time, and I remember having a pretty bad landlord, and the place was disgusting and so forth, and landlord had a hands-off policy, like if it's broken, I'm not fixing it.
Yeah.
But there was a quid pro quo with me, which is good because I want my rent to stay low.
Yeah.
And that was where I was at that particular time in my life.
You had to do what you had to do, yeah.
You live where you can afford to live. But here's an idea. Here's a solution. We're very solution-based here at Mark and the Millennials. Why doesn't Mayor de Blasio cut property taxes in half for these buildings where there are all these thousands of tenants? And the building owner, if he agrees to that property tax cut, has to pass that through to the tenants and say, I'm going to reduce your rent.
Yeah.
Equivalent to the amount that the property tax has been reduced.
Yeah.
Why don't we do that? There's a solution.
I wouldn't even. I wouldn't even be that skeptical of a concept where, people like landlords didn't have to require rent for a certain months of the pandemic, and then subsequently the state understood that was happening and taxed them less, or understood that the taxes that they would be paying to the state would be significantly less, and that the value of the property would be different. I wouldn't even be opposed to a solution like that. But I mean, they're using this as a segue again, like we've been talking about, for bigger, more overarching rent policy.
And government has really created a lot of these problems. I'm not saying government is exclusively responsible for these problems of the cost of housing, whether you rent or buy in places like New York City or the really expensive markets in California and elsewhere. But the fact of the matter is if government is charging you so much in taxes, as we've been talking about this podcast, then maybe we should go back to government and say, cancel my taxes. Yeah. I mean, we should do a podcast just on that. Yeah. We have another clip with AOC about the same subject matter, and she says, my fellow Democrats won't listen to me. It's like, yeah, I think they're not listening to you because you canceled Amazon in your district. You canceled 10,000 jobs.
Cuomo was furious about that. So the gentleman that we've all seen on CNN who's been running around and he's been, the Democrats, golden boy right now, he was exceptionally furious. And a lot of people in the Democratic Party would probably consider him probably the most national and influential figure in Democratic politics right now.
Time.
Yes, at this particular time.
So we have this clip with AOC, and here it is.
I think it's just really important to communicate that these things don't happen magically. They happen when we organize, and they happen when we fight for them. And that doesn't even fight along partisan lines. We have to, as we know here in New York, we have to fight with Democrats in order to make sure that these things get accomplished. And I think sometimes that's the big, nationally it's seen as a scandal to call out Democrats. But we're here in the state of New York. We have a Democratic governor. We have a Democratic state legislature. We have a Democratic city council. And we are still struggling to cancel rent. It's unacceptable.
So AOC, here's the issue. The issue is that as a congresswoman, you have failed to bring jobs to your district. You have failed to convince your constituents that the pathway to success in America is to ultimately one day, if you work hard, and if you really work hard, to own your own home. That really is the place where you want to go. But instead, she's basically saying, no, your situation in America is static. Once you are a renter, you are always a renter. How many people have you met, Garrick, who lived in cities because that's where they started out in their 20s and they loved living in the city, they loved that life. But the fact of the matter is they realized they could never actually own anything there, so they eventually moved out to the suburbs, or they moved into a small town, or they moved to the countryside, and they were able then to buy a home. And with our economy moving to an on-demand economy, more and more people are able to work from home. but she's not interested in having this conversation with her constituents. She's basically telling her constituents, you're stuck in this situation, and it's the man who's really causing you to stay in this situation. It's not government, and it's not necessarily me, the congresswoman. I have no responsibility whatsoever.
Believe it or not, I think to your first point, I think to get into a little bit of the millennial perspective here, I think my generation is much more willing and readily accepting of being a renter as opposed to a homeowner, which I think is a very different... For now. I mean, typically, like the numbers for now have been forbearing.
You're in your early 20s.
But a lot of us are in our 30s. But just generally speaking, I think it's, for like the older half of the generation, it's a lot more common and accepting for various different reasons. I think there's a lot of people who are hesitant for homeownership, not because of any financial reasons, but like, you know, a lot of the upkeep and a lot of the other issues that come with it, and for them, they just view it as easier to rent. But to the second point, I kind of want to talk about one of the other things that she gets at throughout all this is the availability of, you know, cheap housing. And it's, you know, she's always saying that there's not enough housing and there's not enough affordable, you know, housing and things like that. And I think the answer is, well, not the answer. I think the question is really, is there enough affordable housing that people want to live in? Because if you look at a lot of these cities like New York, or Baltimore is a good example that we talk about prominently here in Maryland, or DC, or just any of these general cities, is there's a lot of housing. There's a lot of vacant housing. There's a lot of places that are ripe to be fixed up and rented out, but
no one's living in the housing
to do it.
Yes, no one's living in the housing.
Because it's not advantageous financially, because again, these tax rates we're talking about. You know, there was a Democratic governor in Maryland in the 70s and 80s that we talk about a lot. Here in Maryland, I think it's a good national example that could probably be, again, one of those solutions.
William Donald Schaefer.
William Donald Schaefer, yes. He had this innovative idea in Baltimore that worked, except for, again, we're going to talk about it in a little bit, it has to do with property taxes.
It does.
He basically said every house that was vacant in Baltimore City could be sold for $1 to anybody who wanted to come in and rent and fix it up, and they wouldn't have to pay taxes on it for 10 years or capital gains taxes for 10 years. And then once it was done, you know, you could basically do whatever you wanted with the house, live in it, rent it out, whatever. Now, it worked, and a lot of people came in and bought these houses and they fixed them up. The issue was, is long-term, there's been structural issues with the tax rates. But I think a combination of you know, providing a lot of these vacant units for cheap, you know, building back up these neighborhoods and allowing them to kind of come back into their own, and combination with reassessing the taxing policies of a lot of these cities.
So let me summarize. What you're saying is you have all these folks in many of these cities who are on Section 8 vouchers.
Yes.
And they're on all kinds of assistance.
Yes.
But meanwhile, in the same cities, you have lots of vacant homes.
Vacant homes, foreclosed.
And there's no incentive to fix up those homes because the fundamental property tax structure is so messed up.
Capital gain structure, the price of the house.
That it would cost a fortune to fix them up.
Yeah.
And so, example, in Baltimore, it's totally the norm in Baltimore that if you fix up a 2,000 square foot townhome, which, by the way, is a good-sized townhome.
Yeah, especially for a city.
And in Baltimore, by the way, they call them row homes. But let's just say you were able to do that. And even if it were 1,500 square feet, okay, which is probably more likely the case, and you were to fix that up, it's very likely that you're going to get an assessment. The tax assessor is going to come out and say, aha, you fixed that up. The city wants a bigger share of your income. And now the property taxes for your home are going to be $8,000 per year, which, by the way, is not unusual.
Yeah.
So instead, they'd rather see tens of thousands of vacant homes and row homes than they would give these individuals who are in Section 8 housing give them an opportunity to actually be owners.
Yeah.
And so government is a huge part of the problem, but AOC isn't interested in solving.
No, she just wants to plug a Band-Aid over a pipe that's bursting and hope that it all goes away. But the issue, the responses that she's providing, I don't think answer the fundamental structural issue with the renting market.
And by the way, here is AOC. We have a final clip with AOC on this, the Cancel My Rent movement. And you have to listen to this because this is proof that she's not interested in solving the problem. She's literally saying, don't go back to work.
Ah, yes.
Here is the clip.
When we talk about this idea of reopening society, you know, only in America does the president, when the president tweets about liberation, does he mean go back to work? When we, you know, have this discussion about going back or reopening, I think a lot of people should just say, no, we're not going back to that. We're not going back to working 70-hour weeks just so that we could put food on the table and not even feel any sort of semblance of security in our lives.
So let's make something really clear here. AOC is not saying, oh, let's go back to work during the pandemic at ground zero in New York City. She's referring to the fact that when it passes, the pandemic, that is, that people should not go back to work because they are being exploited. That is classic Marxism right there. Classic Marxism.
Next, we're going to seize the means of production, Mark.
She has no interest in solving problems and giving people opportunity, as we just discussed. She doesn't want to solve them. What she wants to do
create is just giant social movements.
She wants to create a giant social movement. She wants to create envy. She wants to create anger.
Classism.
And she wants to create classism and class warfare. It's just disgusting.
Yeah.
And that's proof right there that this whole cancel my rent, AOC says cancel my rent, is nonsense.
It's part of a bigger conversation she's trying to have, or a bigger agenda.
She's not into it. Right. Because here at Mark and the Millennials, I want to make this clear. We got to put this out there. We know there are people that are struggling paying their mortgages and rent, and we support all kinds of creative ways to help them. Having said that, there's no better way to get forbearance than to talk to your lender or to talk to your landlord personally and ask for forbearance, because government is always a lagging helper. They're very, very slow to help.
Yeah.
You know, eventually.
Look at a lot of the unemployment issues in your state. And if you think that they're going to be able to help when it comes to renting and things like that, you're over your head.
Explain what that means.
So,
you know.
Oh God, I know all too personally. Basically, every person who lost their job or was laid off because of coronavirus had to go to the unemployment line to qualify for either the state's unemployment, and if you don't, then for the $600 a week plus your whatever you would qualify for. It has been an absolute catastrophe across every state in the country. The unemployment lines and their services have been maxed out, undoable. And if you think that suddenly having this same government, these same agencies that can't handle unemployment also start dealing with things like, renting and
they can't even process unemployment claims. That's the bottom line.
They can't even process that. They're not going to be able to help you with your rent.
Yeah, their websites aren't even working. And so, by the way, the cancel the rent movement isn't just in New York City.
No,
it's nationwide.
Yeah.
It's in California.
Seattle.
It's in Maryland.
Portland.
It's in Seattle. And it's the whole part of the movement is to socialize, to use the pandemic as an opportunity to create a socialist country. Statism. So we have a clip about what's going on in California. And California, by the way, already has ridiculously high property values, which is very hard to buy a house in California. And let me make this clear. California is a massive state.
Yes.
It's expensive to buy a home in San Francisco and Los Angeles and coastal
it's
California.
To rent in these places.
However, inland, right, a couple hours inland in California,
it's more
not
manageable.
So much.
Yeah.
It's quite reasonable.
Yes.
Okay. But and we'll discuss that in a few minutes. We have a clip on this about California, and here it is.
Californians aren't the only ones asking to cancel rent and mortgages. All over the country, people are asking their state and the federal government for relief. When asked, Governor Newsom did not say he will cancel rents or mortgages. As for any new state-level policies on the issue,
so we've done a lot in this space. We'll continue to consider doing more.
A third of the U.S. did not pay rent in April. Do you know how many of us aren't going to be able to pay rent in May?
And absolutely. And there's no doubt in my mind that is the case. And that in California, it is probably particularly an issue, just like it is in New York City, because of the simple fact that rent prices are so high, especially in coastal California. And certainly rent prices are high in New York City as well. So it's a problem that we need to find creative solutions to. And we've talked about this, canceling taxes, right? Including payroll taxes, canceling for a period of time, certainly canceling property taxes for a period of time.
I think the apprehension, though, and which is something we have to address, is why the other side doesn't favor this solution is that they genuinely believe that this would be detrimental to the revenue of the state. Now, conservatives, on the other hand, we would argue that by having a more favorable tax code that incentivizes businesses as well as, different property owners and different people to come into the state, that you're actually expanding your tax base. And by expanding your tax base, you're actually expanding your revenue, making up the differences, but also making it a lot easier on people to live and have, free flow of, movement.
I think a lot of this, too, moving forward after the pandemic is we need really robust courses in K-12 public education, relating to financial
Personal
literacy.
finance, yeah.
Financial literacy. It's something that's really missing throughout the United States of America, because I really believe if we had 100% financial literacy in the United States, we would have individuals who would have a vested interest and understand the fact that while you may want to rent lifelong, the fact of the matter is there are other places you can move to where you can actually afford to buy.
Yeah.
And so just because you can't afford to buy in Manhattan doesn't mean you can't afford to buy in Kansas.
Yeah, I use my family for an example here. My family, we're pretty solidly from New Jersey.
Solidly?
My parents could buy. Yeah,
what exit again?
Generationally, 82.
Exit 82, Jersey.
So the example I'm giving is that for us to rent in New Jersey, which we did, we bought a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom, 2.5-bathroom house in Texas. And you moved inland. Texas,
Wow.
yes. So basically what we're paying a month in rent, $2,000 for a 2-bedroom apartment in rent, you can get a house, a full property ownership,
and how much was that house?
Backyard. I don't actually know. I didn't ask them for the thing. But it was basically their mortgage payment came out to about equal to what our rent was in New Jersey.
So you were renting in New Jersey, you moved to Texas, and you're actually buying a house.
Yes.
Because you changed states to a state that's much more friendly from a tax standpoint.
Yes.
As well as just more friendly, generally speaking, to open businesses and so forth. It's
lower
more
property tax rates, so overall they're saving money. There is no income in tax in Texas. It's a lot more beneficial place to live. It's places that understand that by expanding the amount of people who are here, expanding the sources of revenue, that you're actually going to make more than by kind of squeezing the population that you already have.
So talk about canceling rent. So Mayor Jack Young in Baltimore City, he's a mayor that took over because the previous mayor was sent to prison, which is really common, by the way, in Baltimore City.
It's like the
unfortunately
third one.
and sadly. But Mayor Jack Young is running for office because there is a mayoral race in Baltimore City, and that's also in November. He puts up a billboard right on top of his campaign headquarters, and it's a massive billboard, as you would expect. And instead of talking about opportunity, instead of talking about having people move into the tens of thousands of empty houses in Baltimore City from Section 8 housing. And let me say that again. Tens of thousands of houses, row houses in Baltimore are unoccupied. Instead of saying to these folks who are in Section 8, you could actually own these houses if you fix them up and then you start building equity. What did he decide to put on the billboard? What did he decide to message?
Oh, I don't know, Mark. Based off our last 30 minutes of conversation, I guess he's going to say cancel rent. Huh?
Cancel rent. He puts cancel rent, right? Not more opportunity, not more jobs, not lower taxes, not safer streets. No, cancel rent, because the message he's sending to a constituency, which is really the wrong message, I think, is that you don't ever have to pay rent again. And there are people that are going to believe that. And because that's what he's essentially telling them on the campaign trail.
Yeah,
it's
and
disgusting.
then this city, and any city that would have a proposal like this would suddenly go back to their state legislature and they would say, wow, we canceled rent, but we also have a deficiency in revenue here, so we need to make up for it somewhere. So you know what, the state legislator and all these states and cities are going to come back and they're going to try and raise taxes on everybody else throughout the state to make up for the revenue gap in the city.
Absolutely. So get this, guys. Small change of subject, because we like to talk about really interesting things and also funny things. First, something really fascinating and interesting. Murder hornets. Hornets.
First coronavirus, now murder hornets.
Have entered the U.S. and they threaten the honeybee population. Let me say that again. Murder hornets have entered the U.S.
Name. It is an intimidating name.
And they're huge. They're like 2 inches.
It's like the
2 inches long.
Of the insect species.
It's the kind of insect that, because it's so big, if it landed on you, you probably would
freak out.
Male or female, doesn't matter.
Yeah.
You would literally scream.
They are
You'd be
some
like,
of
oh!
the ugliest looking bugs I have ever seen.
They look really
in my
scary.
Life. They're like anything out of a horror movie. Like you see where big life-size bugs and they've got this really gross appearance. This is exactly what the murder hornet looks like.
And apparently, not only do they sting, obviously, because they're bees,
but they keep stinging.
Then they're hornets, but they keep stinging, and they have a venom that can actually kill you.
Yeah, if they sting you enough times, which is conceivable that they do. Apparently, like in Japan and some of the other Asian countries,
people die every year.
People die. There's like how we record, whatever kind of deaths that are random to the United States. This is something that they keep track of every year.
So we almost have to joke about this, because there's a meme going around on various social media networks, and it's a meme of Dr. Evil. And it says, it's Dr. Evil, and he's on the phone, and it says, the pandemic didn't work. release the murder hornets. And it's got Frau Unibrow, who's like yelling, release the murder hornets. I thought it was a funny funny meme.
God. Yeah.
Because it's kind of a sign of the times. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and we got
What's
this
one more thing?
next crazy thing, right? You can't even. We're being told in the pandemic you can't go outside, and now we have murder hornets, and they're saying, well, if they're in your area, you may not want to go outside. I mean, what the world is going crazy.
I think maybe nature was like, you guys got to stay inside, so they gave us a little incentive to.
And by the way, for all of you liberals out there, the murder hornets didn't get here because of global warming and climate change. They got here because they probably traveled on a ship with a bunch of packages from Asia and accidentally.
How does any invasive species get anywhere?
Exactly. Yeah. But I guarantee you, this is the next thing. It's going, we have the murder hornets because of global warming.
Keep them off on the West Coast, please. Don't just stay over there.
So we do have a clip on the, and it's a real clip that is telling you about the dangers to the honeybee population of murder hornets.
Which is already an animal that is in very dire straits.
Yep, it's an insect that's in great danger.
Pivotal to human existence.
Absolutely. And we have a clip on this. It's definitely worth seeing about the murder hornets. And here it is.
A massacre in the honeycombs.
There were dead bees all over the front of the hive, all over the bottom board, and they all had all been chopped to bits. They were decapitated.
Beekeeper Ted McFall says he went to check on a hive one morning in November and found an entire colony destroyed. 60,000 honeybees torn apart in a savage attack. About a month later, the alleged attacker was revealed. This Asian giant hornet found in Blaine, Washington, just a couple miles from McFall's property.
And all it takes is a couple dozen of the Asian giant hornets to show up and start lopping off heads.
Dubbed the murder hornet for its powerful sting and the way it decapitates its prey, this is the first time the world's largest hornet has been seen in the U.S. In its native Asia, Vespa mandarinia is notorious, seen on programs like Netflix's 72 Dangerous Animals. Washington State entomologist Chris Looney says the clock is ticking.
So there you have it. It's pretty, when you watch this video, I mean, you see the murder hornet basically chopping off a honeybee's head and like devouring it. I mean, these things are they're not just like constantly hungry. They're just evil. They just want to kill bees for the sake of killing them.
And our bees aren't used to them. They don't know how to react to them because it's not something they ever dealt with.
Yeah, it's just, right, because obviously it's an invasive species, which is incredible.
I saw a cool video on Twitter, and it was a bunch of, so the Japanese honeybees have obviously been dealing with these for forever, so they have like a natural defense mechanism to them. And it was a cool video, so it was like, you see it come in, and it got what it deserved, because these honeybees, they just like swarm it, like thousands of them just like circle and enclose like the murder hornet and then just kill it. And it's like
just disgusting.
It's like,
I mean,
nature's weird.
It is
wild.
weird. It is weird. And how would you like to be outside and then randomly see this thing on you? It stings you, and then apparently there's a massive
golf ball size
welt that's on your arm or on your shoulder. I mean, and then
plus the toxin running through you probably feel terrible.
And apparently the doctors say when that happens, they say get to the hospital.
ASAP.
I mean, that's really comforting, isn't it?
Yeah. Leave it to Washington, man.
At least with a snake. At least with a snake, you can see it before you step on it for the most part. It's like, oh my God, there's a snake. I'm going to go the opposite way. But with a murder hornet, you might just decide
tiny.
to.
Yeah, you don't see it.
It's incredible.
At least with the snake, like, I mean, what is it? The snakes that we deal with here in the U.S., the only one that's really super poisonous is a rattlesnake. And obviously you hear it because it starts rattling.
Oh, copperheads. There are a lot more snakes that are out there that are poisonous.
I'm not an animal expert here. I'm just going off my own natural.
Okay, the millennial just said the only snake in the United States. Apparently there's a snake in Florida too, by the way, which is really deadly, which is it the coral snake? There's a snake that's very colorful. Podcast listeners, you have to correct me on this. There's snakes, of course, nationwide. They're super dangerous.
I just stay away from snakes, regardless.
That's what I'm saying.
I hate them.
You see the snake, you go the opposite direction.
Yeah.
Not so with a hornet.
Are interesting characters.
Absolutely, I agree.
As pets. Oof.
So next up, Wendy's fast food restaurants. We have something funny. Wendy's well, actually, it's not so funny about there not being enough meat in America. There's a meat shortage. But this part, we're going to try to make it a little bit humorous, since we have to at least have some sort of humor to get through this pandemic. Wendy's fast food restaurants will be taking hamburgers off the menus of some of their restaurants to accommodate for meat shortages in the United States. And that's because of the coronavirus outbreaks at certain meat packing plants. And so Wendy's, of course, is famous for their square burgers. It's because, of course, before Wendy's,
fresh, never frozen beef.
Before Wendy's, all burgers were circular.
Circular, yeah.
So, but Wendy's came along and it's like, we're going to make this a little bit different. We're going to make the burger.
That's how you market yourself. You distinct.
We're going to make it square, and it's going to be like non-frozen beef. It's going to be fresh.
They have
it's
a mean Twitter
better.
game, Mark. They're all over social media. They're roasting everybody else as inferior. It's kind of funny.
And they came into play during the 1980s. Wendy's did. And we have to make a little bit of a joke about this because it is kind of scary that there are meat shortages and there's meat rationing, of course, in some parts of the country. Yeah. And we look forward to that passing. But in the meantime, we at least have to make some humorous comments about Wendy's because Wendy's big promo in 1984 was, "Where's the beef?" And so there's a metaphor here, right? So
Mark,
Wendy's is saying Wendy's doesn't have the beef anymore. Well, get this. There's a commercial that said, "Where's the beef?" And it was the most famous commercial, really, not just in 1984 when it came out, but throughout most of the 1980s.
They brought it back a couple of years ago with like the original lady and everything.
They did.
Because it was so popular and people still know about it today.
It's true. So first airing in January of 1984, the Wendy's commercial portrayed a fictional fast food competitor entitled Big Bun, where three elderly ladies are served an enormous hamburger. The enormous hamburger bun, the burger itself was tiny, but the bun was massive. And so obviously the idea is when you buy a hamburger from most restaurants, the burger is really tiny, but the bun is massive.
Yeah.
So while two of the women are commenting on the size of the bun, isn't that a big bun? They're interrupted by Clara Peller. Clara Peller is this elderly lady who basically looked at it and goes, "Where's the beef?" We have a clip on this famous of all famous Wendy's commercials. By the way, one of the most famous commercials of all time and incredibly effective. And here is the commercial.
It certainly is a big bun.
It's a very big bun.
Big fluffy bun.
It's a very big fluffy bun.
Where's the beef?
Some hamburger places give you a lot less beef on a lot of bun.
Where's the beef?
At Wendy's, we serve a hamburger we modestly call a single. And Wendy's single has more beef than the Whopper or Big Mac. At Wendy's, you get more beef and less bun.
Hey, where's the beef? I don't think there's anybody back there.
You want something better. You're Wendy's kind of people.
She is the cutest lady, Clara Peller. I mean, one of the cutest ladies ever that I've ever seen on TV. And that's what made her so lovable is that...
Where's the beef? I don't think there's anybody back there.
And apparently she was hard of hearing too, so it made it even funnier because it was easier, really easy for her to yell.
Just start yelling.
She naturally yelled. And so it's kind of, once again, a metaphor for Wendy's, which is running out of fresh meat because of the meat shortage in the United States, which we hope can be solved soon. But that particular commercial was so famous that Walter Mondale in 1984, there was a presidential race where, by the way, Walter Mondale ultimately ran against Ronald Reagan in 1984.
Suffered the worst electoral defeat in human history.
But in the 1984 Democrat primary, Walter Mondale was running against primarily Gary Hart. There were others like Jesse Jackson.
I don't even know who that is.
Jesse Jackson and John Glenn. But Gary Hart was the big competitor to Walter Mondale. And Mondale and Hart and others were debating on stage during the Democrat primary. And basically, Hart talks about some issues with small businesses and so forth, something that the Democrat Party hardly talks about anymore. But Walter Mondale calls him out and says,
Where's the beef?
Where's the beef? And uses the commercial.
Substance of your policy.
That's how famous that commercial was from Wendy's. We have a clip on this, and here it is.
Entrepreneurship. 90% of the new jobs in this society have come from small businesses, and I think the dedication of the Democratic Party to minority people in the South and elsewhere shouldn't just be jobs. It should be the opportunity to own and operate businesses that create jobs.
Mr. Glenn, may I respond to that? Well, we'll come back to you. Let some of the others. What's new about coming out from entrepreneurs? You know, when I hear your new ideas, I'm reminded of that ad. Where's the beef?
Yeah. If you'd
let's keep going. Wait a minute. He's going to tell you where the beef is or something.
So there you go. That's from 1984, the Democrat primary debate, using that term, where is the beef?
The moderator got in on it. He's like, well, where is the beef, man?
And isn't it funny, too, that we actually were talking about a few podcasts ago about the dumbest bill in America being, at that time, banning drive-thrus?
Yeah.
And now drive-thrus are Essential.
way, yeah.
They're essential.
The only way to get your
but
food.
these idiots in Minnesota wanted to ban drive-thrus because, climate change, people
Yeah.
standing in line in their cars,
Yeah.
And meanwhile, it's considered to be probably the safest way to get food, at least, without having to interact with a lot of people at the same time. Kind of fascinating. So, Wendy's, we hope you get the beef back so we don't have to say, where's the beef?
Where's the beef?
So next up, we have the dumbest bill in America. And with the dumbest bill in America, Mr. Assistant Producer, do we have a lead up?
Absolutely.
And here it is.
Dum 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 dum.
And it's the dumbest bill in America, and it is bailing out failed newspapers. Let me say that again. The dumbest bill in America is failing newspapers will get bailed out.
Wow.
And why do you suppose they need to be bailed out? Is it because of the pandemic? Actually,
No, they've been failing for years
not.
now.
They've been failing
Because
for
nobody
25
reads the
years.
Newspaper.
You're right, they read it online.
Online, digital, yes.
And the newspapers haven't figured out the new model for advertising. They haven't figured out the new model for
subscriber paywalls.
It's really difficult because millennials especially, tell me if I'm wrong, you all, when you go online, you want to read stuff for free. As soon as you see
Hell
that paywall, you're like, I'm not paying to read that.
Yeah.
Someone else is probably going to write the same story and I'm going to be able to get it for free.
Or we just mooch each other's accounts.
That's right. I hate you guys for that. I'm just saying.
It works. Yeah,
It does work.
How many people are probably on like your Netflix account, Mark? Probably way too many.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure. Well, yeah, that's a good point. But bailing out newspapers, bailing them out, and guess who wants this to happen, first of all? Elizabeth Warren. Senator Elizabeth Warren.
Can't say I'm surprised.
From Massachusetts. She's the leader of this. She wants relief for rural broadcasters and local
I
newspapers.
thought she was against bailouts.
As a result of the pandemic. Exactly. I thought she was against bailouts too. But what she wants to do is to further buy off all of these broadcasters and all of these newspapers because then they'll say nice things about her. And they also have
but
leverage.
nobody reads them anyway, so it's all just a moot point to me. Even if this does happen and bail them out, what are you going to do? Write a puff piece about Elizabeth Warren that 3 people are going to read?
And so to be fair, she hasn't necessarily put a bill in yet because what she's hoping to do is to influence the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, and she wants to influence Acting Director Russell Vought to take steps to support them with money from the stimulus. And she wants to redirect some of that money there. And because, by the way, these newspapers have been failing for years. I just want to give you guys an example. There's my local newspaper, right? Used to be a fantastic local newspaper. They would only
talked about local news.
Only talked about local news. It never talked about national news. It never talked about national politics.
Yeah.
It never talked about things happening in other counties. What it did was it talked about crime. It talked about local crime, local sports, local events, local famous people, local, special events.
Local things in the news.
Stuff
local
that was
government.
fun.
Things
Local
that were
government.
important. Yeah.
The only politics that were covered were local government politics. And then this company came along and rolled up and bought hundreds of local newspapers, including ours. And the next thing we know, on the front page, we've got articles about things that are happening in other states.
Yeah, it's
And
not
we're
why
saying
you
to
watch
ourselves,
the local news.
well, it's not a local paper anymore. In fact, why would I care about what's happening? If I wanted that, I'm going to go online.
And go to
And I'm going to go to some of the
CNN, Fox, ABC, WCBS, all those
exactly.
places.
So they've completely lost their minds, and so as a result, they are failing.
Yeah, know your niche and
You
own
can
your
tell.
niche.
You agreed completely. By the way, they're failing so much that their newspaper content is getting smaller and smaller, and they're laying off people constantly. And as a result, Elizabeth Warren wants to say, no, we want to get stimulus money because of the pandemic, you are going out of business. No, guys, they've been going out of business for a long time. And somebody, hopefully millennials, will come and fill the gap because I do think that local news is extremely important.
Yeah.
And these local papers, while I do believe they're important, they obviously, a lot of them are corrupt.
There's
and they've
just so many
decided
different ways to cover it nowadays, though. I mean, if you look at you don't need to have a company to talk about local news.
Absolutely.
You can have somebody who has a blog on the internet that people like reading. You can
True.
have, independent media companies and things like that. Half the time, I don't even listen to, people who are even at these big news corporations or these little ones. I listen to independent people with their own website that I've read a bunch of pieces on, and I like a lot of the things they say. And that's just the nature of being a millennial and the market that it is now. But I hate to see people like Elizabeth Warren cling to these old days of, print news rather than just letting everything expand.
Because print news is what they always controlled, and and the broadcasters they always controlled.
Yeah.
And by the way, I just want to say this: there are Republicans that are in rural areas that want to get stimulus money to save some of these old papers, these local papers, as well as these rural radio stations as well. But that's because they're constituents, and I think they're pandering to them, even though they know that their fundamental business model is broken, because they're going to be out of business anyway.
It's
in
a
few
bad
years.
business model. If the company can't stand up on its own 2 feet, why should you support it?
Absolutely.
Look, I already have an issue with us, the government, doing things like NPR, supporting places like NPR.
Yes.
Less so do I have a problem with PBS, because I think it's generally geared towards kids and it's like an educational
They're
space.
publicly funded, though.
But they're publicly funded, yeah. So
that's what she wants to do. She wants to publicly fund all media.
Your newspapers,
all
yes,
media.
and all your local radios. And I think
that's dangerous.
It's absurd, yeah.
That's statism. That's basically, the communist government saying all state media will be funded by us.
Through taxpaying dollars.
We don't care if they're profitable or not,
I
because we're
typically
going to
want
pay
my
for
tax dollars to pay some kind of dividend return to
And we're going to have a coordinated message.
Taking money and burning it.
And by the way, it's almost the same thing that happened. This big company that rolled up and bought all of these newspapers in our region, and they did it across a number of different states, the same company. The first thing they did after they bought the newspaper is they started getting hyper political. And they decided that they're going to bring in a lot of the far left progressive articles into our newspaper in our community that is not a progressive community. And so they not only did they not know their audience, but they were so arrogant to think that they could change minds and hearts in a community that could care less about their progressive ideals or their progressive thoughts. And so that newspaper is really on the edge of ready. And my opinion is, let it fail. What do millennials think about this?
I'd rather go on Twitter. I would rather, like I said, I mentioned it earlier, and I'll keep hitting it. This one, it's just not necessary. I don't read a newspaper. So one day I went to Wawa. This is the example I'll use.
Wawa. Explain what Wawa is for all the podcast listeners, because not everybody has.
It's like 7-Eleven. It's just like a place where you can go. It's like a convenience store.
It's a 7-Eleven on steroids. Yeah, it's a massive 7-Eleven.
It's very nice. It is very nice, though. It is upscale. It is almost bougie, but that's beside the point. Anyways. I went to Wawa, I got my coffee and my morning, whatever I was eating, and I picked up a newspaper, right? I picked up one newspaper, the Baltimore Sun, because it's the local newspaper.
You actually picked up a newspaper?
I picked up a newspaper. I was like, this is interesting, because I saw it when I walked in. I was like, wow, I haven't read a newspaper in my whole life. So I brought it home, right? And I'm sitting there at the table, and I'm doing this, and I live with 2 roommates, and they walk in, and they saw that I had a newspaper, and I cannot tell you how thrown for a loop they were that I actually had in my hands a newspaper. And they were making fun of me. They're like, Garrick, that is so old-fashioned, and it's just what our generation is like, and we're most of the media consumption. We don't do newspapers.
You aren't the least bit interested in print media.
No.
What you want is online information.
Because you can take these articles that are on print and you can just upload them online, and it's so much easier.
And you want
it
free,
free. Yes.
Yes, and the Baltimore Sun has a paywall, as does the Washington Post, and
which is why
almost every major newspaper.
Yeah, which I don't have subscriptions to either of those, because I can get that same article from places for free.
So before I go to the clips with Elizabeth Warren, how then do these newspapers, these news outlets that have to pay people to write stories, how do they afford to pay them if Google's taking the lion's share of the advertising, and at the same time, they can't get people to get past the paywall because people don't want to pay?
To quote the great Mark Zuckerberg here, they run ads, but they don't run Google ads and the Google advertising. They run their own set of ads on their own thing. And
it's very difficult to make money.
Yeah, and it's a lot of these online places, they run on what we would consider a skeleton staff, less writers and less people in the newsroom, but they still try to put out content.
But wouldn't you also say too that probably, and I'm sure I would imagine you would agree with this, that isn't one of the major problems the fact that people just aren't interested in what they're writing? I mean, I feel like when was the last time you guys, other than buying the Baltimore Sun newspaper, when was the last time you were online reading an article from the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, the Baltimore Sun? I mean, you guys most of your media choices are, I don't know, they seem very alternative.
Yeah.
I mean, for example, as you said, bloggers.
Yeah.
People posting something on Twitter.
Intellectuals that have websites that you can hear their exact response to certain topics that are going on.
And YouTube, right? Yeah. You can watch YouTube and actually...
Honestly, most of us, we don't even need a article that we have to click. I can just read a thread of tweets and get what I want out of the article.
So we have a clip on with Rachel Maddow of MSNBC interviewing Elizabeth Warren, and Elizabeth Warren's talking about how the economy was already declining before the pandemic, which is not true because it was the strongest economy in American history. But this is, of course, is her justification for constant government intervention, including pre-pandemic. We have a clip on this, and here it is.
So understand it this way. Before the coronavirus was on anybody's radar screen, this economy was already showing the cracks. Lending defaults, loan defaults were up. Small businesses were failing and not able to help not able to service their debts. There were declines in manufacturing. You kind of could see shaky signs in the economy.
Actually, what was happening is, and what continues to be happening is, we're moving towards an on-demand economy where you want instant information, and you also want your product instantly because you order it online, you kind of want it right away. That's why we have DoorDash and Uber. That's why we have FedEx and UPS. But she doesn't fundamentally understand the economy, which is not a surprise. And by the way, what she could do, Garrick, she could really work harder to repatriate American industries back into the United States instead of whining about how bad the economy was before the pandemic.
Yeah. She's just, you hit it real hard, Mark. I don't really know how else to kind of say the same thing, but I agree with you. I think she just kind of misunderstands. I don't even think she misunderstands. I think she just deliberately puts forward a different
false information,
view of the economy that isn't really rooted in the reality of it.
And we have a second clip from her, and here she's trying to do the same thing as AOC. Here's Elizabeth Warren basically trying to create fear and envy and division between groups. And she's talking about bailouts, just like she wants to bail out, of course, the newspaper industry that's failing, as well as the rural broadcasters. And here is the clip.
Look at history. Wall Street always causes economic chaos to the working class and bailouts by our supposed leaders.
Yes, it's always Wall Street that's always getting bailed out. No, actually, that's not true, number one, and there have been bailouts in the past. And by the way, if you own, most Americans who have retirement plans or pensions with states, they're invested in the stock market.
Bailed out.
And so if you want the stock market to collapse, the entire economy goes bye-bye.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry, she is a complete idiot.
She's talking about 2008. She's talking about the financial collapse of the big banks.
Except this was recent.
Yeah.
This was recent. I mean, by recent, I'm like within the last week, she said this.
Yeah. And it's gross because, you talk about who really got bailed out in 08 is, the banks got bailed out, but where do banks get their money? It's you, me, it's your grandparents, your parents, your kids. It's anybody who's got an account.
But she wants to bail out failing newspapers and failing rural broadcasters, as well as anyone else that she can buy off, because these are the people that we rely on to receive our news, and so many of them.
But we don't.
Not all. So many of them have been so corrupt for so many years and not properly reporting things. We just saw this huge New York Times scandal where they basically tweeted something and then they took the tweet down and rewrote the entire tweet about Biden's affair. The allegations.
It's always funny. People see these New York Times, they'll publish an article and it'll have a headline. And it'll be like, conservatives will watch the headline, how it gradually changes over a 2-hour span from whatever was kind of like pretty accurate and factual to whatever the spin is, whatever the Dem spin is per se.
Straight out of 1984.
Yeah.
Final thoughts on this, Garrick, the dumbest bill in America.
Yeah, I think, bad business models, let them fail. And we don't need newspapers of the local variety to be hyper-partisan. Write about local issues. Talk about your high school sports team. Talk about the new shop opening up in the town. Be more about information, less about politics.
And be more creative and use YouTube when you do interviews.
Yeah.
Not just blogging and writing, which is important, but also do interviews and get people to watch it and figure out a way of monetizing it.
Engage the community, because that's what the big thing that newspapers are supposed to do for local newspapers is they engage the community. They start a conversation where people in the community are talking about things going on in the community. But when you're talking about things that are, externalities to people's lives that they don't really pay attention to, generally, you're going to lose people. You're not engaged in the community. You're not building up your audience, people who care about what you have to say.
And that is the dumbest bill in America. Thank you for joining Mark and the Millennials. That's it for us this particular episode. This is Mark Fisher. Thank you to our millennial, Garrick Ross, and our assistant producer, Christopher Hopkins, and our producer, Adam Katura. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and our website. See you next time.